Should now go that.
Where's mine? Is there a go live button? Is there a go live button?
Yeah, it's already live.
Well, it's live. Okay,
live.
you used to say click start. You used to say
sorry about that.
start.
We are already.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Myths About Publishing panel. So we're getting started a little bit late today, but I think we're going to do around 30 minutes of questions and then 15 minutes of audience questions. So I'm going to ask everyone, starting with Dan, to introduce themselves, and then I will introduce myself, and then we will kick things off with some questions. So Dan.
Hi, I'm Dan Coxon.
Hi, I'm Dan Coxon. I think I'm here for kind of multiple reasons. So I'm editor at independent press called Unsung Stories. We don't put out a lot of stuff. We do about 3 or 4 books a year, but we've got numerous awards nominees and award winners. We actually have a launch immediately after this. If you want to see what we do, you can skip next door after this to the main launch. But I'm also a proofreader and copy editor, working freelance. I work with various publishers, and I'm also a writer. So obviously I work with publishers from that end as well, so I think I'm here kind of to represent many different angles.
Okay, I definitely can't compete with that.
John Baker. I'm John Baker. I'm an agent in Bell Lomax Walton. I've been agenting for about 2 years.
Gabriella Houston's at the back.
Gabriella Houston's at the back. And then AM Shine, the Gallant with London Prize winner, Esme Jacqueline Pearson.
Everybody else, super impressive.
Everybody else,
not out.
Super impressive. Not out.
So yeah, that's it.
Hi, I'm Mark Gipps. I'm the publishing director. I'm the publishing director of Gallant and the SF Gateway. I've been in publishing for about 10 years. I was a bookseller for about 10 years before that, and my partner is an author, so I can speak to different.
And my name's Juliet Mushens. I run my own agency, Mushens Entertainment. I've been an agent for 10 years, and prior to that I worked at HarperCollins. I represent writers, fantasy writers like Jem Williams, who's guest of honour this weekend. You can catch me interviewing her at 3. And outside of genre, I represent people like Richard Osman, who wrote The Thursday Murder Club, or Jesse Burton, who wrote The Miniaturist. And I am also married to a writer, so really covering it all off. So the description of the panel is basically talking about the common misconceptions about the publishing industry and how do things really work, because a lot of people have assumptions, some of them true, some of them not. So I thought I'd start off by talking a little bit about an agent's perspective of how the process works. I'm going to get John to kick in, and then pass to Marcus to talk about from a publisher's perspective, Dan to speak as an author and as an editor. So from an agent's perspective, how it works. So from an agent's perspective, how it works is we receive submissions, we receive normally a cover letter, a synopsis, and the first 3 chapters of a finished manuscript, and we make a decision based on that of whether it's a no for us for many reasons, or it's we want to see more. We'll then call in the full manuscript, and if we read the full manuscript and we really enjoy it, we'll probably get in touch with the author and ask to represent the manuscript. Sometimes we compete with other agents if lots of people want to represent the manuscript, sometimes we're the only one. And then our job really is to work with the author editorially on their manuscript and to pitch the book to our contacts throughout the industry, and to try and get the author a publishing deal in the UK, but maybe in the US, maybe internationally, look at film rights, TV rights, and to be the middleman in the whole process. So when the author edits the late, which obviously Marcus is editor, or the author hates the jacket, or the marketing plan isn't particularly convincing, it's our job to interrogate the whole process and act as an advocate for the author. So I guess one of the most common myths I would say about agenting is that the role stops when we get the author a book deal, that it's once we've got a book deal, we've signed with whichever publisher, that's our job done. And actually, I think that's often the beginning of the
absolutely. That's where it gets really fun.
That's where it gets really fun.
just this
get to be
kind of. I like to
just
see it
this.
as I just
It's
kind of.
I like to see it as I just kind of drop
maybe
in
getting a
where
little tense, so the
things
author
are
and the
maybe
editor
getting a
can,
little
like,
tense, so the
preserve
author and the editor
their
can like preserve their relationship and never have to have a conversation that neither really enjoy.
By the
So
way,
I can come in and be like, by the way, this is what's happening, and maybe we just saw this. The cover could maybe we've just thinking if it's.
Also, then at the end, I couldn't have to talk.
Also, then with the editor,
Oh, she's a
I
little
can
late,
talk.
tiny bit.
Catch up. Oh, she's a little late, she's a tiny bit, the tiniest bit late. It's going to be in the next minute. I'm literally on the phone to her right now. That kind of thing.
So it's very relaxed.
Not that kind of thing. So it's very relaxed.
Once I've sold
It's
it,
fun
because
for
then
me.
it's just
Once I've sold it, because then it's really just
everything happens
seeing
in
it,
background,
making
letting the
everything
editor
happen in
do-
background,
get
and
everything
letting the
right,
editor
and letting the author
get
feel
everything
happy.
right, and then letting the author feel as happy as possible. So there we go. That's kind of generally it.
That's very interesting because I definitely do work with agents.
That's very interesting because I definitely do work with agents who do something and then do step up. And I'm not saying that they're not good agents.
It very much depends on the author.
It very much depends on the author. You know, if it's an author I've been working with for 10 years, well, over 10 years, I've been publishing for 10 years. But there are authors who've been with the list for 20 years, and at that point, the relationship should be okay, and absolutely the agent should step in if something goes wrong. But they don't need to hold that author's hand all the way through the process.
But I think especially when it is your first book,
But I think especially when it is your first book or your first deal,
stay involved,
agents who don't stay involved are a real
it's interesting you say about being sort of the conduit.
It's interesting you say about being sort of the conduit. I think, and this is with my editorial hat on rather than my publisher hat.
But the editor's job is also to be.
But the editor's job is also to be the conduit between the author and agent and the rest of the company. Because we have a hub for sales and marketing and publicity and production and design and art and legal. Everything should come through the editor.
So I think often editors feel that they're doing the same.
So I think often editors feel that they're doing the same
working with an author
thing.
and
Staying obviously working with an author. A lot of it that you won't see, a lot of the editorial conversation between an author and an editor won't be seen by the rest of the company. You're just expected to provide a book for them to go and sell.
And then with my publisher hat on in terms of writing the list.
And then with my publisher hat on in terms of writing the list, I think that's much more about looking at balance, making sure that all the editors have got enough projects that we think are the right ones, making sure that the list feels the right size with the right elements. And that's a bit more strategic, and you have to step a bit further back and say, yeah, you might have a great book by a great author, but that might not be the one thing we need for next year. We've only got one slot for next year, so it's not the right time.
I think that's one of the things that's quite difficult.
I think that's one of the things that's quite difficult.
To explain to new authors about
the ecosystem of how publishing works and how a big publisher, and that's made very
does have to look in the round of
that
what else we got.
Does have to look in the round of what else we got coming out in this month or this period or this year. Not even just another genre, but as a company, do we have the resources to do this properly in the way that we want to do?
Yeah, it is very different for a smaller.
Yeah, it is very different for a smaller publisher like immediate. I mean, the immediate thing that just mind is as well that we don't just have agents that we work with. We have an agent and authors. So just because you don't have an agent, it doesn't necessarily mean that it won't get published. It's very harder, and you probably have to do more of the legwork yourself, and you're the one that has to feel those sort of conversations.
It does happen, and we have
that kind of thing. But it does happen, and we have a handful of authors who. We have ones who actually were unagented when they came to us, but
I mean, we do occasionally offer on an agent.
I mean, we do occasionally offer on an agent to books. First thing we say is, you've got an offer, go get an agent. You'll find someone who will represent you who actually has that relationship already, and we would rather have that relationship.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest as well, I think a lot of it.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest as well, I think a lot of it's to do with the fact that we deal with much smaller budgets than you do with, so we can't offer big advances and things.
Because of that as well,
because of that as well, I think we tend to offer
a more collaborative process, but just
I would say a more collaborative process, but just partly because of the unagented nature of the author times, is that actually the author sometimes at the moment has a lot of dealing with this, has a lot of ideas, we're actually seeing she's got some ideas, we've had an artist work on those ideas, she's given feedback, we're now working with that feedback, so she's actually having quite a hands-on experience in terms of what the cover's going to look like and what the blurb's going to be like on the jacket. But I mean, that's not to say it doesn't happen in bigger companies, but I think that's something that is part and parcel of what we do most of the time. I think the other thing I wanted to mention is, putting a slightly different hat on, is working as a copy editor and a proofreader. I think a lot of people don't understand what those people do in the process. Very briefly and quickly, a copy editor basically would take it from, once the editor has finished doing the development of the manuscript and has the manuscript more or less ready, and they're happy with it, it tends to go to a copy editor who will then sometimes gets called a line editor. That is slightly different, but nowadays the roles tend to get merged quite often, I've found. and in fact sometimes they try and merge the proofreader copy editor role as well. But generally speaking, you're looking at fine-tuning it. So whereas the editor may have looked at the broader strokes, you're looking at just for like little errors, little grammatical errors, little typos. You're looking at continuity, making sure that nothing's been missed, and continuity, that everything works in terms of the narrative. And then once it goes to the proofreader, that's usually at the very final stage when it's almost ready to go to print, and then you're looking for mistakes that have snuck in with the typesetting, the way it's been laid out, and just that everything is ready to go. A lot of it, I think, personally, is to do with just having more sets of eyes on it, because that's something you know, when you've looked at a manuscript over and over and over and over again, you become blind to aspects of it sometimes. You've seen it so often that you actually can't sometimes spot these kinds of
it's like your
errors.
brain fills in what it thinks is going to be there. I always remember when I was at HarperCollins, we did a big marketing presentation for a really, really important author, and they'd mocked up, bus sides and the whole thing. And it was in that meeting that the author pointed out the sentence didn't make sense, that the tagline that we'd all looked at 100 times was missing a word. And it was just such a reminder that sometimes you really do fill in what you think is going to be there rather than what's actually there.
I got called into the office once. I was working from home, and I got a call saying you got to come in now, so I came in to find my boss had realised that we had printed 5,000 copies of a book. The title was Elric of Melniboné, and unfortunately on the title page it was Elric of Melon Bone. And of course it had gone through so many people, proofreaders, and me. The author had seen it, the author's bibliographer had seen it, the production files had seen it, and all these people, and we just hit print on it and nobody noticed. And the first read, somebody said this to me when I was starting out, it's the editor's job to make the author feel like they've missed something. It's the copy editor's job to make the editor feel like an idiot. It's the proofreader's job to make the copy editor realise they're not a proofreader. And it gets out into the world, and it's the reader's job to find the typo immediately that everybody has missed.
Yeah.
There's always one in there somewhere.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So when we were chatting before the panel, we were talking about myths that we come up against time and again that we wanted to unpack a little bit. And I think one of them that we come up against a lot is this idea that the slush pile is a terrible place where good manuscripts go to die and no one ever reads them, which is really, really not the case. So, John, do you want to talk a little bit about how agents and how you work with the slush pile?
Yeah, absolutely. So, joys of my agency is very small, and I don't have an assistant, so the only person reading my slush pile is me, which is fabulously fun. I'm averaging, I'm sure Juliet's is 1,000 times more impressive than mine, but I'm averaging somewhere about 50 to 60 a week, maybe even busier than that sometimes. And yeah, I will go in and I will eyeball at least every single one of them. And sometimes, upsettingly, you can probably tell from the first couple of lines that this isn't going to be something ready, or somebody's written just some complete lunacy, and you're like, okay, cool, that's fine, they're not ready. But a lot of the time, I go in and I have a read. I read just 2 paragraphs of the cover letter, and I don't want to spoil any of the other questions later, so I'll get to that wide later. But I'll find out what the hook is. If I like the hook, I like what you're telling me, then I'll go and have a look at the writing. And then if I read the whole submission, that's usually a good sign enough to find out I want to read the rest. So but of that, I would say, of my list of, I did a count before just for some stats, for a 2-year agent, I've got 11 clients. Of that, I'd say I've got 5 from the slush pile. So of that ratio, though, of the agency, we got, 4,000 submissions last year, 6,000 the year before. So the slush pile, I obviously love the slush pile, but it isn't, the ratio is tough, there is no question of that. But I always look at everything, and you really want to find that spark, because it's not a question of whether they're a brilliant writer or whether the idea isn't good. You just have to believe, because agenting is tough, and we're out in the trenches, and we are throwing ourselves on the altar of editorial taste every single time we send a book out.
So powerful.
Very much so, very much so. We really have to believe 150,000% that this is the book that should exist, and I want to be the person to make it exist. And that kind of special feeling when you can read something and you can picture which editors are going to love it, and then you've got that kind of gut instinct that this is something awesome. That's what you were looking for, but you really have to root through it to find it. But that's kind of went a bit over the place, but that was general slush pile there.
Definitely, and I think what's interesting about that myth is often people see clients when they're really established, they're a Sunday Times bestseller, so they forget, or New York Times bestseller, they forget that actually once upon a time they were probably sitting where you are now and working on something, and they sent it out. So for example, the Miniaturist sold 1 million copies and is published in 42 languages and was a BBC series. And when Jessie sent it to me, she was a PA. I didn't know who she was. She sent me a cover letter, the first 3 chapters. I thought, this is a great book. I'm going to call in the full manuscript, offer representation. Or Taran Matharu, who has had, he sold 8 million copies in the English language of the Summoner series. He was also someone who sent to me via my slush pile, you know, first 3 chapters, synopsis. I loved the concept of demons battling one another in a school, and took him on for that. But I think probably that myth comes from the fact that people see them at their most successful and presume they were always there, when actually for a lot of people they were just, you know, looking up the agent's name in the Writers and Artists yearbook and taking a punt. But that's what's built pretty much my entire career. And Marcus, you mentioned earlier that you sometimes take on unagented submissions. So do you have like an open submissions month or things like that?
It's changed. I mean, obviously the last 18 months have been different for everybody. We used to do an open period probably once every 18 months. And what we found was that we just got so swamped that you then end up sitting with a pile of things that we don't have quite the same amount of time to go through that an agent would, I think. And so we would be late getting back to people, and that didn't work, I think, for anybody. I also felt that we were getting manuscripts which were clearly rushed to get in during our deadline. So we currently have a quiet open submissions policy, by which I mean we are open to them, we have a slush pile, we go through them as quickly as we can. We've sometimes had notices on our website saying, just to remind you, we are open. But yeah, so it's not a secret in any way, shape or form, and we get a steady trickle. But
my husband read your slush pile once.
Yes.
Years ago.
And
I did as well, once when I...
but we have, I mean, the first person I ever bought came from our slush pile. That was, to be fair, 10 years ago. But we do go through it, and actually what tends to happen more for us is that, again, we're talking about the first 3 chapters or whatever. If we see something we really like, we will probably ask for the whole thing, but we will probably also say, we think you should go and talk to some agents. Here are some agents who we think might suit you. Not because we don't want to deal with people directly, because we can do, but just we feel more comfortable having that other pair of eyes on it as well.
And Dan, you said that obviously most of your submissions just come to you directly, so how does that process work? Do you read? Is there a team who reads?
Interestingly, we're kind of thinking of moving towards what Marcus was just talking about, because we had an open submissions window, and again we got swamped with stuff, and a lot of it just wasn't suitable, or you felt people had rushed to fit it into the window. Yeah. And we did have a team of people working on that. I think we had 4 or 5 readers who worked through it first, and they would then score things, and those which were scoring higher we would then take a look at as well, and we gradually kind of narrowed it all down. I think the real plus side, and it's, again, something I thought about before we came here, was that the 2 books that we have shortlisted for Best Fantasy Novel at the British Fantasy Awards tomorrow, and the book that we are launching tomorrow next door, all came out of that submissions window, all 3 of them. Now, 2 of them were people who we were aware of. So Ashley, whose book we're launching today, had actually published a story of mine in the past, so I was kind of aware of him on the scene. And Tiffany Angus, whose novel Threading the Labyrinth we published, I'd met her. You know, I don't particularly count among my friends or anything. You know, we know each other, but I had met her and was kind of aware that she was writing things. The other one, Dark River by Rick Kachacha, which is up for Best Fantasy Novel and Best Newcomer tomorrow. None of us knew her. She'd never published anywhere. She was a complete unknown, and we were more or less the first people that she'd even sent anything to, I think. And it just blew us away. And like I said earlier, it's like, you know, you cannot read every single manuscript. I remember that we did have one that came with a covering letter that said, you have to read all of my 100,000 word manuscript in order to fully appreciate it.
Oh, God, we've had those, and you just want to say, well, maybe the twist is worth the payoff, but...
Obviously, you can't sell that. You can't sell a book to people that you have to get to the end in order to appreciate it. That's just not marketable. You know, we did read some of every single manuscript that came in. There were a small number that filtered through, and then of those we decided which ones we wanted to go with. And some of those that we turned down, I've since seen come out with other publishers. In fact, one of them I then went to work on as copy editor for a different publisher.
Actually, that was something I did want to mention. So much of this is about finding the right connection with an editor or an agent at the right time. And just because someone says no to it doesn't mean anybody else will, and it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the book. I mean, I try to give constructive feedback when I can. But it may just be that the book is not right for me, but it might be perfectly right for my, counterpart at another publishing house, and that is slightly just luck, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that's something that everyone needs to remember, is that art is subjective as well. Because I think there's this idea, you often see these things go viral which will say, you know, this huge best-selling manuscript was turned down by 100 people, what do they know? But it is so subjective. Like, if I tell people my top 10 favourite books of all time, half of them will be like, really, I didn't finish that, didn't really get on with that, thought the characters were dull. So I think they're definitely, that is a really good point to remember, Marcus, is that we're all responding to it in a subjective, individual way. Something you said, Dan, I wanted to touch on as well, when you mentioned one of the authors didn't have any writing credits before, hadn't done anything, this was the first thing. Because I think sometimes we hear this idea of, you know, you've got to have won prizes, you've got to have had short stories published, you've got to have built your platform. And in my experience, I don't find that to be true. I'm not particularly, if you have that stuff, I think it's great, but it's not, for me, I'm interested in the novel or the piece of work. But what do you guys think about that?
Absolutely the same, doesn't matter one iota to me. I mean, yes, it's a bonus, that, and it also means that when you're sending your submission letter out, you can put a little line saying, so-and-so has been published here, here and here, and that's slightly easier, but that would never make me decide one way or the other whether, like, I would wanted to go the whole 9 yards with somebody because of how great their book was, not because they've been published here and there and everywhere. So definitely not for me.
I had this conversation with somebody yesterday in the lift, actually. But I was saying that, you know, it would never do you any harm to have all those things. So yeah, so that's great. I mean, if you're doing all that stuff, and equally if you're at things like this and meeting people and going to panels and that kind of thing, again, that's great and it will help. But at the end of the day, it's still always going to come down to the words on the page. And if the manuscript's great and I love it, I'm going to want to publish it. If it's great but I don't love it, then someone else will probably publish it. If it's not great and you need to work on it, then no matter how many short stories you got published elsewhere or prizes you won or whatever, it's probably still going to be a no, unfortunately.
I do think I agree with everything you've just said. I think they are things which can maybe bump you slightly up a little bit in my reading list. But then the things that will do that more powerfully are who the agent is, what the pitch is like. It's just a little maybe bonus. I think if you've published a full novel somewhere else, that can be very interesting, because it does just give us a bit of a chance to look at sales figures.
Or it can be tricky.
Or it can be not so good, because if you look at the sales figures and they aren't very good, that makes it more tricky. But in the end, it comes down to, do I like the book, and can I, not just do I like it, can I see myself selling it? The same is true for social media stuff. You don't need to have Twitter followers, you don't need to have a website. Those are things which you might want to start working on as you move up to publication, but you definitely don't need them when you're submitting. No one's going to say, well, I like the book, but they only had 400 Twitter followers, so I'm not into it.
Do you know what? It was bloody Jonathan Franzen. He did this whole piece about how he knew as a fact that agents didn't read manuscripts unless the person had 10,000 Twitter followers. And I was like, who would have the bloody time to literally look every single person up? Lots of my clients don't have social media at all because they don't want to have it.
Yeah.
And also, I think that even if you have tons of Twitter followers, it doesn't necessarily convert to quite a few celeb books in my time, or a couple of my authors are celebrity ghostwriters, and sometimes someone might have 8 million followers on Instagram, but the conversion or the click-through rate might be something like 800 people. And so I'm absolutely not swayed by someone having a big social media presence. Also, I would say often with my authors, when they are really active on Twitter, I'm like, interesting, you've missed your deadline. Yeah. Really funny tweet you did there. Maybe you can write your book.
I guess the one place, and this is quite niche, but I'm going to mention it anyway, where I think there is interest is where you have an already existing, I'm going to use IP, which means intellectual property. So we are seeing more books based on podcasts, for example. You know, I think there are things like that where you can say, I do actually have a following for this stuff, I just wanted to change it to media. That is interesting.
Yeah, and I think I literally almost have this sort of mental little flag that raises when there's something interesting in a covering letter like that. It's like, it doesn't make me like the manuscript more, but I kind of like raise a little flag that's kind of like, okay, well that might be worth a look, I'll take a look at that.
Yeah,
and same with kind of
definitely.
award winners and things like that. It's kind of,
I think it's all of that stuff that it kind of comes down to the work itself, and the work itself has to be good, but it's all of those extra things that can make you think, I already love this, and this is great, rather than, I don't really like the work, then we're not going to be that swayed. So that brings us quite nicely onto opening things to the floor for questions. So who wants to ask the panel something? Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about timescales in terms of from the point of sort of signing a deal to the book coming out and what happens on like.
Sure, so I'm just going to summarise the question
As it's
first.
safe.
So the question was, can we talk a little bit about timescales? So how does it work from the point of, for example, an editor buying the book to the book actually being published? So Marcus.
Far longer than you think, but it all does make sense. Publishing is still built on a very old model, and I think there are lots of arguments that we should be nimbler, and I agree with. I think if you're going with like an ebook only publisher or a small press, these are things which will be different. But the fact is, we still need, if we want to get a book into Waterstones, they need to know about it with the cover and the full description and everything at least 5 months in advance, which means we have to have all that stuff ready 6 months in advance, which means even though you've got your finished book and we're sitting on it maybe 8 or 9 months in advance, we're still not ready for it. We still can't sell it to what is still our second biggest retailer. So it's a very slow process, but I would normally say we aim to have about a year between delivery of manuscript and publication. So it comes in, the editor edits it, which is maybe a month, and it goes back, you tweak it again, it comes back. So we're maybe T-minus 10 months, and then it goes to a copy editor, and that will be another month, and it goes to production, who will put it together into an actual final book, and that will be another month, and it will go to a proofreader, and that will probably be, I mean, it's not always a month, it might be a couple of weeks, it might be 6 weeks, but and while all of those things are happening, simultaneously we're working on the cover, we're working on the marketing and publicity plans, the sales team is selling it into the shops, we're getting all that stuff done. It is a slow process, and there's definitely moments in it when the author, I think, sits there going, I don't understand what's happening, I handed it in, why is nothing happening? And it's just all scurrying along in the background. But it will be very different from you guys.
And Americans have even longer lead times, I was going to say. So often it's a year from the finished edited, line-edited manuscript before it will come out for publishing, which can sometimes make it quite challenging in my role to marry up publishing deadlines, because the UK publisher will be like, we want to do it next summer. And I'll be like, next summer? You're having a laugh? Summer the year after, I think. So, yeah, it can be challenging.
Although that doesn't stop the Americans coming to us and saying, we're publishing in 3 months. Do you want to take it? Ah, frustrating.
So it is different from mine, but in multiple different ways. I mean, so as an author who's worked with a small press, Black Chuck Books, who've done some really nice stuff recently and are up for Best Independent Press tomorrow, they work very quickly. Steve, who runs it, works very quickly, and basically once we had the manuscript finished and he was happy with it, he was like, well, when do you want it to come out? So it's much more hands-on like that. With Unsung, we swing slightly more towards the normal publishing model, in that we do sell books through Waterstones and through normal retailers where we can. So because of that, we have to get marketing materials out there, we have to get advance information out. And because we're only a 3-4 person team, actually we need quite a long time, probably more than a year on some titles, to actually get things polished and get things moving. Equally, I've worked with, as a proofreader and a copy editor, I mean, sometimes I get proofreading jobs where they get in touch with me on Wednesday and they want it back by Friday. And it's usually when their backs are against the wall because they have a deadline, and quite often I do a lot of proofreading for Titan, because they do a lot of franchise material. Often it's the franchise material because it's been slowed up in the rights process with the studio or whoever it is that owns the rights. So depending what you're writing and who you're working with, I think it's quite variable.
I think that's partly why we build so much room into the schedule, because of course also all of these people are also working on multiple books, and if your proofreader ends up being 2 weeks late because they had something else which ran late, that's going to be a problem down the line. And the editor, your book may come in on deadline, and that's great, but if 2 other people delivered a week before, I sort of have to read those ones first, so that can slow things down as well. I think our job, though, and we're not always great at it, although I try to be, is to be as open about that stuff as possible, and to say, look, actually there's going to be a delay because of this reason, and keep the author and the agent informed. But
I'm a firm believer in under-promising and over-delivering. Do you have any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I was actually wondering, if one's written a manuscript but has only done 1 edit through it, who do you speak to sort of give it a bit more a flavour to it, to make it tighter before you approach an editor? Or does an editor help that? And the other bit of that question is, have you ever had a synopsis been done as a poem?
So the questions there, the first one was, once you've edited your book, should you go to someone else to have it edited before you send it to a small press, or you send it to an agent? And also, have we ever had a synopsis as a poem? Do you know what? I've definitely had a synopsis as a poem before, just because I've been an agent for 10 years. Someone will have done it. Probably a limerick as well. And then I'll be interested to hear your opinions as well. I would say I don't expect an author to get any kind of professional editorial service done before they send the book to me. I recommend that the author does probably 3 rounds of edits themselves on the book before sending it out to an agent. But I will then expect to do editorial drafts with the author, normally, maybe 2, maybe 3, before I send the book out to a publisher, who will then edit it themselves. What about you guys?
Yeah, absolutely. I would never definitely say to somebody, go out and spend money on this, because that's technically, that's if I think you've got promise, that's the work I should be doing, and that's. But there are places out there, there are services, and there are some very talented people out there who are working and providing these things, and there's nothing wrong with using them if you would like to use them. But it's definitely not going to say go do that.
I mean, I think if you were going to self-publish, then paying for an editor is probably sensible. I think if you're looking for an agent or a publisher, I think Juliet's right. I think one edit pass is probably not enough, and I think you probably do need to get someone else to read it. If it's a friend or something like that, not paid, but just to get someone else's eyes on it. They may not come back useful, but I would feel nervous about sending in a submission that had been edited once by me and nobody else, and thinking that would be as good as I can make it, because it needs to be as good as you can make it.
Yeah, because I work as a freelance editor, I have occasionally done freelance jobs for private individuals, not just for publishers. I'm kind of a bit picky because I don't always have a lot of time, because I've got quite a steady stream of work coming through. But they do tend to be people who are self-publishing. On occasion, it's people who are kind of like, I might send this round to some agents once you finish with it, but I'll probably end up self-publishing. They just kind of want to see if there's any interest before they go that route, so that's something you could consider. But yeah, exactly what Marcus has said. I think you need to have someone else's eye. Trust to be frank and honest with you. So you don't want someone who's just going to read it and go, oh, that's lovely, I'm so happy for you, and give it back. You want someone who's actually going to give you something you can work with. Possibly someone who's going to be slightly mean about it. I mean, sometimes it's quite good to have that friend who actually is a bit critical, who will actually say, well, this didn't work for me, this didn't work for me, I didn't like that character. Because you need to know that stuff.
And there are writing groups, both in real life and online, where you can join in and you will, in return for someone looking at your work, you will be expected to look at someone else's. But that's a nice way to get sort of a circle going as well.
Yeah, definitely. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, this sort of goes back to the days when people used to say, we publish authors, not books. Is this an urban myth, or did Zadie Smith really present herself as, I went to Cambridge, I'm 6 foot tall, and I don't look like the back of a bus?
I have
that one before?
I've never heard that before, so I imagine it is an urban, it is an urban legend. And if the question's about, publishing authors, not books, I don't think that's true, because my background was marketing when I worked at HarperCollins, and if someone goes into a bookshop, if someone goes into Tesco, if someone goes into WH Smith, if someone goes into Waterstones, a lot of the time the book buyer doesn't even know the author's name. It will just be, it's a blue book that is about a lighthouse. Or I read a review of this book and
it was on the radio last week.
Yeah, I read a review of this book and it sounded quite funny. And interestingly, we see less author loyalty than we used to. So when I started in my career, it would be the case that if someone read Philippa Gregory, they would read whatever Philippa Gregory wrote. Whereas now, if Philippa Gregory doesn't have a book out, someone will buy an author that does the same thing that Philippa Gregory does in a different way. And if that author moves to a different genre, often a lot of those readers won't follow them. So I would say it's definitely a bit of a myth that it's about, you want to have a really hot, Cambridge-educated author, otherwise you're not going to publish them.
Promotable.
Highly promotable.
I think, as with the sort of the social media things, and it doesn't matter if the author is someone who never wants to leave the house and doesn't want to do any interviews. That's fine, if the book's good. It is true, though, that if there is a story or a hook, that's not uninteresting later down the line. Because if you're doing publicity, if you're doing marketing, it's useful to be able to say, oh, I don't know. So I've got a science fiction book coming out next year, and the author's studied planetary geology at Oxford and got her PhD in it. So for me, that's a useful hook, because I can say this person is actually a planetary scientist, we know this stuff is real. But it doesn't matter, the book would be just as good if that wasn't true, but it does just give me something to tell the story with.
Yeah, absolutely. I have an incredibly cool guy I met at a one-to-one who he looked like a maths teacher, perfectly chill as anything, and it turns out he's in the future warfare division in the army and spends his days working out how we're going to kill each other in 100 years. He's written a sci-fi, and it's incredibly cool. So that kind of hook is definitely kind of adds something, and it's something that will attract editors' attentions. While obviously, Mark, as you're very aware of how many Asian submissions are coming in at the moment, so anything that comes in you can do to get away from that does help. But if that person wants to be completely mysterious and never admit anything about themselves other than the name they want on the book, then that's also fine. The book's great. So, yeah.
I think as well, the marketing departments tend to worry more about these things than editors do. I think editors, if they love a book, they will love a book and they will fight your corner to get it published. And then the marketing department will work out what they do with it and how they market that later. So, to some extent, I mean, you know, again, it's one of those things where if you've got an interesting story to tell,